friends, it's Patty. This isn't a polished brief like I normally do. This is kind of a same day chit chat about uh, watching the Supreme Court hearing earlier. This morning, the court heard arguments on Donald Trump's attempt to narrow birthright citizenship with an executive order. And Trump himself was sitting in the room while they argued over who really counts as an American. I want to talk through what birthright citizenship actually is, what went down in that courtroom, and why some of the arguments, especially around Native citizenship, are pretty ugly, and why I think this matters to way more people than the way it's being framed on most cable news channels. So let's start simply. After the Civil War, the 14th Amendment wrote a clear rule into the Constitution. If you're born in the United States and subject to its jurisdiction, you're a citizen. That was meant to slam the door on the idea that you could be born here, especially as a formerly enslaved person, and still be told you're not really an American. For more than a century, the rule has basically been if you were born here, you're in. There are a few narrow exceptions, like kids of foreign diplomats, but the default has been birth on U.S. soil equals citizenship. That's the settled law piece entire generations have lived on with that understanding. Trump's executive order is trying to carve out a new exception. The idea is if your parents don't have the right immigration status when you're born, if they're here without papers or on certain temporary visas, you would not automatically be a citizen, even if you were born in, say, Texas, California, New York, anywhere. The administration is basically arguing that the phrase subject to the jurisdiction in the 14th Amendment gives them the wiggle room to say, well, actually, some kids born here aren't really covered. Lower courts have blocked this order and said in plain language, no, that's not how any of this has been understood for over a century. So now it's in front of the Supreme Court to decide how far a president can go in narrowing citizenship without changing the Constitution itself. So, what actually went down this morning? First, Trump shows up. That alone is wild. A sitting president walking into the Supreme Court while the justices hear a case about his own power to decide who is and isn't a citizen, it's a huge power move visually. But the big thing is the questions. To my ear, and from the early reporting, this did not sound like a slam dunk for Trump's side. You had justices who were usually seen as conservative asking things like, why should we throw out the simple rule everyone understands? Born here, you're a citizen. How is an executive order enough to rewrite a constitutional guarantee that's been treated as settled for generations? The lawyers defending birthright citizenship hammered a point that resonates with normal people. If you stop someone on the street and ask, what's our rule? They'll say, everyone born here is a citizen. That's the common sense understanding this order is attacking. And they warn the court. If you buy this theory, you aren't just changing the rules for future babies at the border. You're inviting challenges to the citizenship of millions of people, past, present, and future, based on who their parents were when they were born. The justices didn't look super eager to be responsible for that kind of chaos. One thing that really struck me today is how the government is leaning on old cases about Native Americans to justify this. Back in the 1800s, the Supreme Court decided a case called Elk versus Wilkins, where it said a Native man wasn't a 14th Amendment citizen because he was seen as part of a separate political community, his tribe, rather than under the jurisdiction of the United States, the way the court wanted to define it. That opinion was used to deny Native people full citizenship for decades. The administration's legal team is now dusting that one up and saying, see, even the court once said that not everyone born inside the borders automatically gets 14th Amendment citizenship. So we can draw the lines too, this time around the kids of undocumented parents or people on temporary visas. Here's what they're not saying. Native Americans today are citizens by birth because Congress explicitly said so in 1924, and that law still in force. Tribal nations and Native advocates are furious that the history is being used as a prop in a case that's really about giving a president more power to pick and choose who counts as an American. So when you hear them talk about jurisdiction and special categories, understand they're reaching for some of the ugliest parts of our legal history to open the door to new exclusions today. So if you only catch the headlines, this all sounds like an immigration fight, anchor babies, border, and all that. But think about what happens if the court blesses this move. A few things will come into play. Suddenly, a U.S. birth certificate may not be enough. You're now talking about parents having to prove they had the right status when a child was born. Anyone without perfect paperwork becomes vulnerable to someone in an office deciding they're not really a citizen. You create a category of people whose citizenship is always suspect. Even if the ruling technically says, going forward, we all know how this works in practice. Employers, schools, cops, agencies starting to question people who've never been citizens on paper their whole lives because of their parents' status. And you hand future presidents a template. If one executive order plus one Supreme Court decision can shrink birthright citizenship, there's nothing magical that prevents someone else from shrinking it again. So this isn't just about them, whoever you picture when you hear immigrant. This is about whether the floor underneath your citizenship stays solid or becomes something that can be chipped away from the top down. So for me, this case sits in a bigger pattern. Changing changing who gets a vote, changing who gets counted, and changing who gets labeled an alien or other. Birthright citizenship is the foundation under all of that. If you can make citizenship itself conditional based on shifting categories or paperwork, you've shrunk the we in we the people. And that is exactly why I keep talking about digital democracies, power, policy, and precedent. Right now, one president and 9 justices are essentially deciding in a very elite space how far the government can go in redrawing who belongs, while the people who have to live with that decision get zero direct say in this. In the world I'd like to see, any move this big, something that touches who is a citizen, would require a plain language explanation to the public and a direct vote. Not an executive order, not courtroom drama, but millions of us as Americans weighing in on whether we're okay with that line moving. But we're not there yet. But watching this play out makes it really obvious why we need to get closer. So, where does this leave us today after the arguments are all done? So, my read is that the administration had a pretty rough day. Several justices, including some conservatives, sounded really uncomfortable with the idea that a president can just scribble an executive order and quietly narrow birthright citizenship. That doesn't guarantee anything, but it matters. For you and me, here's what I want to hold on to. When you hear this talked about like a niche immigration fight, remember this is about whether citizenship is a stable right or a flexible category politicians can just play with at any time. Pay attention to who uses Native history to justify new exclusions and who actually listens to Native communities warning about where that logic goes. And start asking people around you a simple question. Are you okay with presidents having the power to redraw who counts as American without us ever getting a say? I'll have a more structured breakdown up on my Substack probably tomorrow with some links and a little bit more history and all this. So, some thoughts on how this plays into digital democracy, and we'll see where this goes. I mean, I'm going to keep an eye on this. We likely won't have a ruling anytime soon. Last I heard, it's going to be probably June before we get anything. For now, I'm hopeful after listening to the arguments, but again, nothing's guaranteed. For now, thanks for hanging out with me for a quick same day reaction. I'll see you guys on the next one.